So I think we're all set. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Guido Schmidt and Daniel Fett, who are going to be having this talk on single sign-on on the web. Give them a big round of applause, and I hope you're looking forward to the talk.
Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to our talk on the security and privacy of modern single sign-on in the web. So in this talk, Daniel and me, we are going to present not only just attacks on OAuth and OpenID Connect, but also some thoughts about analysis of all these standards. So first, a brief introduction. Who are we? We are researchers from the University of Trier, but soon of University of Stuttgart. And also we happen to be the founders of the Maschinendeck hackerspace in Trier and the Pi and More Raspberry Jam. If you're interested in anything else what we are doing, you can just follow us on Twitter. So, what is this single sign-on about? What are we talking about? So probably all of you have seen websites like this, like TripAdvisor, where you can use a lot of different methods to sign in. You can sign in with your Facebook account, with your Google account. You can register an account at their page with email address and password, or you can use your Samsung account, or probably now even more different systems. And if you click, for example, on this Login with Facebook button, a new window pops up prompting for your Facebook credentials, or if you're already signed in into Facebook, just asks for confirmation. So this is a setting we are looking at. And we have two parties here. We have TripAdvisor as the so-called relying party, and we have Facebook as the so-called identity provider. And the basic principle of how this works is the following. So first you go with your browser to the relying party. You say, I want to log in with that IDP. Then you contact your identity provider, authenticate there. And this identity provider then issues some kind of token. And this token you give to the relying party. And the relying party can now use this token to access some parts of your account at the identity provider. And this is called authorization. For example, the relying party can use this token now to post on your Facebook timeline or reach out your friends list from Facebook. And the relying party can also retrieve some unique user identifier and then consider you to be logged in with that user identifier. And then this is authentication. And then RP can set, for example, some session cookie and mark this session belongs. Remember that this session belongs to this user. So this was the basic principle. Why should we use single sign-on, or why shouldn't we use single sign-on? So for users, it's very convenient. You don't have to remember which account you used where, which password, and so on. You just click and log in with Facebook and you're all done. Of course, this comes with lack of privacy because Facebook then always knows where you log in. And also, the identity provider you choose is also a single point of failure. If that one closes down or changes its terms and conditions, then you perhaps cannot log into your accounts anymore at some third-party web pages. So for relying parties, they need to store less data. They don't have to care about password databases that can leak. They don't have to care about user registration, password recovery, and all the hassle that comes with user accounts. But they also have less control over their users' accounts because they outsource the authentication to this identity provider. And also here, the identity provider is a single point of failure. So for identity providers, the advantage is clear. They get more user data, and they can provide some service for their users, which makes perhaps it makes it more attractive for users to use that identity provider. On the downside, they also have to take care about more user data. They have to store and protect it, and they have to have the overhead of implementing and running this single sign-on system. So, what are these single sign-on systems? Now I will show you some prominent examples. So there's OAuth 1.0. So this is a not so modern single sign-on system. It's now 10 years old. Many flaws are known for this system, and basically nobody uses it anymore except for Twitter. So Twitter uses a modified version of OAuth 1, which more or less fixes all the known flaws. But in general, we can say don't use OAuth 1. There's also OpenID, which is also quite old, 9 years. It's not that user-friendly. It's a standard that's meant to be super flexible for every corner use case that the developers at that time thought of. And this makes it also extremely hard to use correctly, because you have a lot of things going on, things change during an OpenID run ad hoc, and it's not that nice to develop something for OpenID. So also for OpenID, don't use this. And there are now modern single sign-on systems, for example, OAuth 2, which is also used in login with Facebook. This is completely incompatible to OAuth 1. And OAuth 2 uses the so-called BIRA token approach. That is, the whole protocol is based on some random values that are passed around, but there's no crypto involved, except for the transport layer for HTTPS, for example. And OAuth 2 is used everywhere, almost. So it's the most popular of these systems, but it has never been developed for authentication. And really, it's not meant for authentication. And if you Google for OAuth 2 and authentication, you, after some time, stumble upon the following picture. So these two guys are members of the OAuth working group, and they really insist it's not meant for authentication at all. It's just for authorization. Okay, nonetheless, it is used in practice also for authentication. Facebook, for example, uses it for authentication. And so this protocol is now 5 years old. Many flaws have been discovered. Most of them have been fixed. I will talk about some of these flaws later in the talk. So this is OAuth 2, and there's also OpenID Connect. OpenID Connect is quite new. It's 1.5 years old, and it's an authentication layer on top of OAuth. So the first definition or real definition on how you should use OAuth for authentication, but it changes the standard also a bit, so it can be seen as a protocol on its own. But OpenID Connect, although despite the name, it's also completely incompatible to OpenID. And it has also some dynamic features like IDP discovery, identity provider discovery, and stuff like that. So this leads us to the web single sign-on chart of confusion. So we have OAuth 1, which is the marketing predecessor of OAuth 2, but completely incompatible to OAuth 2. And OAuth 2 serves as the foundation for login with Facebook, for authentication, and also for OpenID Connect. And the OpenID Connect, there's OpenID, which is the marketing predecessor of OpenID Connect, but also same here, it's not compatible to each other. And OpenID Connect is used, for example, by Google. So these are the most commonly used web single sign-on systems. There are also some others. For example, Mozilla Persona. Who of you have heard about Mozilla Persona? Oh, okay, around 5%, more or less. So it's the original name is Browser ID, and there the idea was that the email providers become the identity providers. So this comes from the thought that for classical website where you have to register, they send you emails with tokens you can click on to log in into your account or to reset your password. So your identity, so your email provider already is a kind of identity provider. So why don't we just use it directly in the web? And Mozilla Persona is the first single sign-on system with the goal that we have some kind of privacy in the sense that the identity provider does not learn where you use your accounts. So we will talk about this also later in this talk. So it was developed by Mozilla, and the first idea was to integrate this protocol in the browsers, which never happened. So they went for the target to have a pure web implementation using just HTML5. And they also built bridges to OpenID and to OAuth to get some big identity providers in the system. But this whole approach failed, but it's still interesting if you want to look for privacy. Okay, there are also some other protocols I haven't talked about. And now I will hand over to Daniel.
So, what is this talk all about? So what is our talk all about? So what we want to do is we want to analyze whether web mechanisms, in this case web single sign-on protocols, are secure when they are implemented correctly. So this means if we follow all the standards and all the best practices. Or in other words, are the standards and protocols that define the web secure? And so the current state of the art is that we have a lot of documents that define some login mechanism, for example, like OAuth. And we have an expert or a group of experts, and they look at this, and after a while they say, well, this seems kind of okay-ish to me. So they say it's secure. So this is the current state of the art. And what we want to do also as part of our PhD research is to change this in a way that has been already successful for other things in the internet, for example, for TLS. We want to create a model of the web infrastructure and of web applications, a formal model. And these models, of course, they are also always incomplete, but nonetheless useful, as has been shown with TLS 1.3. So we create this model, and then we put a lot of work into this, and finally, hopefully, we can create proofs of security for mechanisms or for standards. Of course, the hard part is number 2 here, as always. And some things our model cannot capture, and we don't want to capture these. So, for example, phishing attacks, or click-jacking attacks, or just stupid users that send their password to the attacker. These are things that are out of the scope of the stuff that we are looking at here. In the same manner, compromised browsers or compromised databases and so on. So when we have this model for a web application, one important question, and maybe the most important question, is what is security? And what is privacy, if we want to look at privacy as well? So we have to define this, and luckily we can define this if we have a formal model like we have. In the following, of course, I'm not going to present all the formal stuff. This is boring. Therefore, I have a high-level overview of what our authentication properties, for example, look like. Authentication in a web single sign-on system means that an attacker that even has full control over the network, say NSA, should not be able to use a service of a relying party as an honest user. So the NSA should be unable to log into my account, at least, yeah, if they're not coercing the owner of the relying party or something. And this is an obvious property. There's a slightly less obvious property, which says that an attacker should not be able to authenticate an honest browser to a relying party as the attacker. So the attacker should be unable to force Alice's browser to be logged in under the attacker's identity. This is a property that is often also called session fixation or session swapping, because if the attacker would be able to do this, he could, for example, force me to be logged in at some search engine. And if I then search something with the search engine and I'm logged in into the attacker's account, then the attacker could be able to read what I'm searching for at this search engine. Okay, so these are the authentication properties. Then we also have another property that is important, namely session integrity. Session integrity means that if the relying party acts on Alice's behalf at the identity provider or retrieves Alice's data at the identity provider, then Alice explicitly expressed her consent to log in at this relying party. So, yeah. This is session integrity. And a third property that we have is privacy. And privacy in this case means that a malicious identity provider should not be able to tell whether the user logs in at the relying party A or relying party B. So, for example, if auth would have privacy, which it doesn't, then Facebook would be unable to tell whether I log in at, say, Wikipedia or myfavoritebeer.com. There are also other notions of privacy, which we, however, will not look at in this talk.
Okay. Microphone? Okay. I think my mic is not on. Test? Okay. Good. Let's start with a more closer look to OAuth. When I say OAuth, I always mean OAuth 2, not the older OAuth 1. So OAuth 2 is mainly defined in RFC 6749 and also some other RFCs and some other documents. OAuth itself has 4 different modes it can run in. So there's the implicit mode, the authorization code mode, the resource owner password credentials mode, the client credentials mode, and all these modes can have many options, which I won't list here. And out of these 4 modes, the first 2, implicit mode and the authorization code mode, are the most common ones. So let's have a closer look at these modes. So the implicit mode works like this. Here we have an example with some random relying party and Facebook as the identity provider. So first you say, I want to log in with Facebook at your relying party. Then your browser gets redirected to Facebook. Facebook prompts you for your authentication data or for some confirmation if you're already logged in at Facebook. And then Facebook issues a token that's called the access token. And Facebook redirects your browser back to the relying party and puts the access token in the URI. And then for some technical reasons, we need some additional steps to retrieve this access token from the URI because it's in the fragment part. And then finally the relying party retrieves this access token. And now, with this access token, an access token is the same, basically the same thing as in this first high-level overview when I just talked about tokens. So access token is such a token which gives the relying party access to the user's account at Facebook. And now the relying party can retrieve data or act on the user's behalf at Facebook. Or it can retrieve a user identifier and then consider this user to be logged in and issue, for example, some cookie. So this is the implicit mode. There's also the authorization code mode. There things start similar. The user says, I want to log in with Facebook, gets redirected to Facebook, authenticates at Facebook, and then Facebook, instead of issuing an access token, it issues a so-called authorization code. And the relying party then takes this authorization code and redeems it for an access token directly at Facebook. So we have here one intermediate step with this authorization code. And then the access token, the relying party retrieved, it can then use to act on the user's behalf at Facebook or consider the user to be logged in. So let's talk about selected attacks on OAuth. First, let's talk a bit about known attacks. There are attacks like the so-called cut and paste attacks, where you reuse some of these tokens like access token or authorization code, or there are also some other tokens which I haven't talked about, so I left out some details before. It's about reusing these tokens from different flows, mixing them into a new flow, and then break the system. So there are a lot of cut and paste attacks known, and the OAuth working group is continuously giving advice on how to prevent these cut and paste attacks. Another problem is if you don't use HTTPS, then you are screwed, because a man in the middle can easily read everything, all the tokens that are exchanged. So if you're in some Wi-Fi and the guy next to you is sniffing on the Wi-Fi, you log in and don't use HTTPS because some developers forgot that there is something called HTTPS, then basically the whole thing is screwed. And also if you just rely on cookies, then you're also screwed because cookies lack integrity. It's very easy to just inject cookies into your browser over HTTP, and then these cookies will later also be used over HTTPS. So yeah, cookies are also not a good thing to rely on. So let's talk about some attacks we have found in our research. There's the 307 redirect attack, and it works like this. First, we have some regular OAuth flow, and if we, in this OAuth flow, if you have a closer look at what happens here in step 2 to 4, we have the user authentication, and after this authentication, the user gets redirected back to the relying party. If you look more into the details of these requests, so first you have this request where you go to your identity provider and ask, start the OAuth flow there. So you just came from the relying party where you want to log in, clicked on that button, log in with this IDP, you get redirected, and then your browser contacts this identity provider. Here I have been redirected to you in an OAuth flow. Please authenticate the user. So this is the step 2A. Then your identity provider returns some form where you have to enter your username and your password usually. And then you enter your username and password, and these are sent over to the identity provider. And now, if this identity provider redirects you back to the relying party and uses the wrong HTTP location redirect method for this, namely the 307 method, then the following happens. The browser is instructed to just repost all your credentials. So if you're logging in at some malicious relying party, that relying party gets your username and password. So this happens if you use 307 redirect. Fortunately, we didn't find any identity provider in the wild who actually uses 307, but you can never exclude that there's some implementation which makes actually use of this location redirect method. Also, if you look at the standard, how these are defined, it's not always clear which redirect method has which details and behavior. And also the OAuth working group didn't think about this. So in their standard, they write, just use any method. And surely the mitigation here is don't use 307, for example, use 303 instead. So the next attack is the identity provider mix-up attack. I will present this in implicit mode and only one variant of this attack. Here in this attack, we have the following setting. We have from step 2 on, all these requests are usually encrypted, but the very, very first request, there we cannot be sure it is encrypted because a lot of web relying parties, when you go to their website, you go over HTTP. And this very first information, where you just click, I want to use Facebook to log in, there you could easily assume this is not a sensitive information. So this very first request goes often unencrypted, or if you, for example, consider other attacks like TLS stripping, then you also cannot guarantee that this request is encrypted. So now for an attacker who, for example, sits in a same Wi-Fi network as you, so probably the guy next to you, could easily mount the attack as follows. So when your browser sends this request to a relying party, log in with Facebook, the attacker can easily change this and change it to just use the identity provider that is run by the attacker. Remember, you can have a lot of different options of identity providers, and with some extension, this can also be extended dynamically just by entering some domains. And then the relying party thinks, okay, that user wants to use the attacker identity provider. It answers with a redirect to the attacker's web page. But now, as the attacker still sits as man in the middle, he can just change it back to Facebook. So the OAuth dance continues as usual. You go to Facebook, authenticate there, you get redirected back with probably some access token, and then eventually the relying party retrieves this access token and wants to use this access token. So what happens? It won't use this access token at Facebook, but at the attacker instead, because it still thinks that the attacker is the identity provider that is used here. So in practice, if you want to mount this attack, then you have to take care of more details, like when you want to break authentication instead of authorization. So in the version I just presented, the attacker gets the access token, can act on the user's behalf at Facebook or at some other identity provider that uses OAuth. So this is not limited to Facebook. But to break authentication at the relying party, there are some other further steps needed. But there are also some other details that have to be taken care of, like client identifiers, which relying parties use to identify themselves to identity providers. The same for client credentials, which are optional, by the way. And in OpenID Connect, the layer on top of OAuth, if this is used, then you need to take care about some other stuff like the switching of some signatures or exchanging some signatures and so on. But it's still possible, so that we successfully attacked real-world applications, and this definitely works. And there are also some variants that do not rely on that first request going over HTTPS. But explaining all the variants would take a whole talk on its own. So we'll now skip this and talk about mitigation. So the mitigation we propose is quite simple. So the one problem is here in step 3, this access token is just some opaque string. The relying party cannot see who issued that access token, so it needs some further information carried along with this access token, and that is who is the identity provider which issued this access token. And if you have this information carried along, then the relying party can easily detect this attack and see that there's a mismatch in step 5 to the one in step 1A, where the relying party received the message, the attacker identity provider is to be used, and in 5 it gets the message, here's an access token and it's from Facebook. So there's a mismatch and this whole flow can be aborted without the attack being successful. So this is the mitigation. We talked to the OAuth working group at the IETF, so they invited us to a kind of emergency meeting to discuss this attack, and we scheduled public disclosure of these attacks, so at the beginning of this year. In June, we had this triggered an OAuth security workshop, which took place in June. New RFC with the mitigations is in preparation, and also the working group is showed interest in the kind of formal analysis we do to this. We carry out for these kind of standards. So to sum up, the security for OAuth 2, if you have all these fixes applied and there are no implementation errors, then we can say that in terms of security, OAuth 2 is quite good. We have formal proof in our model for this. But regarding privacy, OAuth 2 does not provide any privacy at all.
Speaking about privacy, we mentioned earlier already that there was a single sign-on system that tried to provide privacy, namely browser ID, alias Mozilla Persona. So as we already said before, this is a web-based single sign-on system with the design goals of having no central authority and provide better privacy. Spoiler alert, they failed at both. So how does browser ID work? So let's have a look at this on a very high level first. So as Guido already said, in browser ID, the mail provider is the identity provider. So we have a user, Alice at mailprovider.com, and in the first phase, when using browser ID, she does the following. She goes to her identity provider and first creates a public-private key pair. And then she sends the public key in a document with her own identity to the mail provider, and the mail provider then signs this document. And this creates the so-called user certificate. And this certificate is then sent back to Alice. Now, in the second phase, if Alice wants to actually log in at some website, and then she does the following. She creates another document containing the identity of the website where she wants to log in, say Wikipedia. And to do so, she signs the identity of Wikipedia with her own private key. And this creates the so-called identity assertion. Now, Alice sends both documents to Wikipedia, and Wikipedia can then, of course, check these documents, because Wikipedia can check first, it can retrieve the public key of the mail provider, can check the user certificate, and then also can check the identity assertion. And yeah, then Wikipedia can consider Alice to be logged in. So this was the basic idea of browser ID, which is quite nice and clean and simple. And then they started to implement this using just standard browser features, including all the workarounds for the Internet Explorer, and so on and so on. And they ended up with a quite complicated system. So here we have, on the left side, in Alice's browser, two windows, namely Wikipedia, and the login dialog, which is provided by a central authority, which they try to avoid, login.persona.org. And inside both of these windows, there are other iframes, and inside one of these iframes, there's another iframe. And on the right, we have these servers, so the relying party, the identity provider, and the central authority, login.persona.org. And just to give you an idea how complex the system ended up, they all talk to each other using HTTP requests, but also using post messages, and also using XML HTTP requests. And as you can see, the system became quite complex. To add even more complexity, they did the following. They thought, well, some users, they are already using Gmail or Yahoo, so let's provide some nice interface for them. They provided the so-called identity bridges, specifically for Gmail and Yahoo, which at the time supported OpenID authentication only. And they created 2 new servers, the so-called bridging servers, one for Gmail called Sideshow, and the other one for Yahoo called Big Tent. Now, the user authenticates to the bridging server using OpenID, and then a bridging server has an interface to the standard browser ID interface. So one problem was that OpenID identities, they are not email addresses. So in OpenID, you add an attribute, which is called the email attribute, and we're talking about this email attribute in a minute. So let's have a look at how these identity bridges work. We are not going into all the details of the browser ID or persona protocol, because this would be too complicated. But the identity bridge is interesting and also important for some of the attacks that we found. So in the identity bridge, the following happens. So here on the left, we have Alice's browser. In the middle, we have Sideshow, so this identity bridge. And on the right side, we have Gmail, which could also be Yahoo in this case, but yeah. Let's say it's Gmail. So first, the user says that she wants to log in at Sideshow, and then Sideshow sends an OpenID request requesting the email attribute signed from Gmail. This request is then forwarded to Gmail, and Gmail sees this request. The user logs in at Gmail for authentication, and then Gmail creates this OpenID assertion, which contains the signed email address attribute for Alice. And as you can see, this is all in a green box, so all properly signed and nice. And now Alice's browser redirects this document to Sideshow. Now Sideshow doesn't check the contents of this assertion for itself. Instead, it sends these things to Gmail. Gmail checks everything that is signed and tells Sideshow, yes, this document looks correct to me. Everything that was signed by me and was not tampered with. Then Sideshow looks at the document and sees, Alice wanted to log in, so this must be Alice. The user must be Alice now, and provides a cookie because the user is now logged in as Alice. So far, so simple. Now for some of the attacks that we found. First attack, identity forgery. So here we have essentially the same that we saw before, the same setting, except now we don't have Alice's browser on the left, we have the attacker's browser on the left. The attacker can go to Sideshow and say, I want to sign in. Now, Sideshow sends this OpenID request to the attacker, and the attacker can change this request. The attacker can just remove the request for the email attribute from this request, which is still a valid OpenID request. Gmail sees this request, and now the attacker logs in. The attacker doesn't have Alice's user data, so the attacker just logs in with his own credentials. And now Gmail creates an OpenID assertion containing the signed attribute which was requested, which was none. So essentially the document is empty, at least it is without any email address. Now the attacker can simply add a new attribute to this document containing an email address that he has chosen arbitrarily. This, of course, is not signed, which is not a problem because this document can be partly signed. And this document is forwarded to Gmail. Gmail now analyzes this document and sees, well, there's a signed part in this document. So I check this signed part. This signed part doesn't contain anything useful, but it is correct. it's not the wrong signature. So it checks out. And it sends back to Sideshow, yeah, I checked this document, looks fine to me. Now Sideshow looks at the document, sees that there's an email attribute, uses this email attribute, and the attacker is signed into any Gmail account that he likes with browser, that is used with browser ID. Okay, so this is bad, as you can imagine. And we told the Mozilla guys about this, and they were quite fast. So we were really surprised. They were really quick. So I think it was in the middle of the night for most of them, but they scrambled in the bug tracker and they wrote some patches and so on and so on. And I think it wasn't 24 hours later that it was all deployed and fixed. So this was quite good. But then we took another look at the system. And we found identity forgery number 2, which is actually remarkably similar. It works as follows. So the attacker sends the authentication request, you know this part, and Sideshow wants the signed email attribute, and the attacker now doesn't change anything. The attacker just forwards this request to Gmail. Gmail asks for the credentials, the attacker signs in, and sends back the OpenID assertion containing the signed email address of the attacker. So no attack up to this point. And now the attacker can do the following. The attacker adds another attribute, another email attribute. And yeah, you can guess what happens. The document is forwarded to Gmail. Gmail checks the signed part of the document, which is still fine. Sends back to Sideshow that everything is fine with this document, and Sideshow selects the wrong email address. Yeah, and now the attacker is signed into any user account again. Okay, so this was the second identity forgery attack. We also found another attack which is not very spectacular, and we also looked, so this was all, of course, authentication, and we also took a look at privacy. So as you remember, privacy says that, or in the words of Mozilla, the browser ID protocol never leaks tracking information back to the identity provider, except it does. So ideally, the identity provider should be unable to tell where the user logs in. In fact, this is broken because in a browser the following happens. If a malicious identity provider wants to find out whether a user is logged in at some specific relying party or not, then the malicious identity provider can just open an iframe containing the website of that relying party he wants to probe. Now the following happens. The normal JavaScript of browser ID runs in this relying party because it has browser ID support, obviously, and creates an iframe. And inside this iframe, another iframe will be created. But this innermost iframe will only be created if the user logged in at this RP before. Now, since the outermost and the innermost iframe, they come from the same source, and of course they can collaborate and communicate. They can, for example, just send a post message, say, hi, the user logged in at this relying party before. So an identity provider can easily probe whether a user logged in at some relying party or not. And this, unfortunately, cannot be fixed without a major redesign of browser ID because they relied on all these iframes and so on. Yeah, so I think this can be considered broken beyond repair. We also found some variants of these privacy attacks which rely on other mechanisms, but essentially, yeah, you get the idea. Privacy in browser ID is broken. Okay, so to sum up, browser ID, we found attacks, but we also were able to fix them with respect to security. And we also used our formal methods to prove the security of the fixed browser ID system. But privacy is broken beyond repair.
Okay, this leads us to the question, can we build a single sign-on system that provides security and privacy in the web? So we thought a lot about this question, and then we used our formal model to design such a single sign-on system, and we could also then use the formal model to prove that these properties are actually fulfilled. So the basic principle of the system, it's called Espresso for secure, privacy-respecting single sign-on, is the following. We have the user with her browser. This user wants to log in at some relying party, for example, at Wikipedia. So here we have the same idea as in browser ID to use the email address and the email provider as the identity provider. So the user enters her email address, and then the relying party asks for some proof of this identity. So the user goes to her email provider, which is her identity provider in this case, authenticates there, and then the identity provider creates a document that proves Alice's identity, and Alice then forwards this document to the relying party, and the relying party can check if everything is all right, and then consider the user to be logged in. So let's have a closer look on how this system works. So here again, we have Alice's browser, the window of the relying party. Alice enters her email address. The email address is sent to the relying party. And now the relying party creates a document that contains the identity of the relying party itself. And this document is encrypted, and we call this document then the tag. So now the tag is sent along with the key that was used to encrypt this document. So this is symmetric encryption with a fresh key, sends it to the browser. And now in the browser, the Espresso code opens a new window of the identity provider that is given by the domain of the email address, and sends the tag over to this window. This login dialog prompts the user to authenticate, so the user now enters her password. And this is sent along with the tag to the server. And now the server creates this document I've just spoken of in the last slide. And this document, we call it the user certificate, or user assertion. Sorry, user assertion. We send it back to the window, the login dialog. And now we have a problem. We could just send it over to the Wikipedia window. But I will show you in a minute why this is a bad idea. So instead, now we have a third party, the forwarder, which serves just a single static JavaScript file. And this is loaded in an iframe in this login dialog. And this iframe gets the user assertion, and it also gets the key. And now it can decrypt the tag, look who is the intended receiver, and then it sends over the user assertion to the window of the relying party, which forwards it to the server of the relying party, who then can check if everything is all right and consider the user to be logged in. So why do we need this forwarder? So at first it may look strange. So let's look what happens if we just don't have this forwarder. So let's assume the user wants to log in at some malicious relying party at attacker.com, enters their email address, but the attacker wants to impersonate the user. He wants to log in at some other relying party, let's say to Wikipedia, for example. And the attacker goes to Wikipedia, says, hi, I'm Alice, I want to log in. Wikipedia creates a tag. This is sent over to the attacker, who just relays it to the user. The protocol runs on, the user authenticates to her identity provider, and then we just send the tag over. As the identity provider does not know who the intended receiver is, because we want to have this privacy feature. This just went through, and the attacker gets the user certificate and user assertion and forwards it to Wikipedia. And then the attacker is considered to be Alice, and this is bad. So we need some mechanism to prevent that the user assertion is forwarded to some random party, but only to the intended receiver. And for this, we have this forwarder. Now you can think this forwarder may be also malicious, but let's talk about this in a second. So let's just talk about what the forwarder does. So the forwarder gets this, gets the user assertion, and he gets the key to decrypt the tag. And now he can instruct the browser to send a post message, but only to a window of Wikipedia. So the browser checks, is the receiver a window of Wikipedia or not? And if it's not, it doesn't deliver this message. So this protects the user assertion to be leaked. And now you may think this forwarder may be malicious and deliver some other script that does strange things, like forwarding things to the attacker directly. But we can enforce that the correct script is running inside that iframe using sub-resource integrity, where you just tell the browser in this window only this code may run. And in this case, the forwarder cannot just put some arbitrary or malicious code in this iframe. And also, there is no information that leaks back from the browser to the forwarder. So to sum this up, as I've just presented Espresso, it features privacy and authentication. It's open and decentralized, so you don't need any specific central party. It's compliant to web standards, that's based on HTML5, and we have formal proofs that all these properties we've talked at the beginning actually hold. And you can find a demo and more information on espresso.me.
Okay, now to conclude the talk, what is the takeaway? First of all, we've talked, I think, most of the time about OAuth 2.0. Most of the results also translate to OpenID Connect. We have formally proven the security of the protocol of OAuth and also OpenID Connect, which is a nice result. Of course, if you are okay with having no privacy, because OAuth and OpenID Connect don't have any kind of privacy that we talked about. Regarding OAuth 1.0 and OpenID, I think they can be considered deprecated and shouldn't be used. Browser ID Mozilla Persona was a nice experiment, but is dead now, and also has broken privacy. With Espresso, we have shown, however, that you can achieve privacy in web single sign-on using standard HTML5 features and standard web features. But of course, for now, it is a proof of concept. As you have seen, we don't even have a nice logo yet. Yeah. So, and one target audience are certainly developers. Use libraries wherever possible. For example, PyOIDC is written even by members of the OAuth and OpenID Connect working groups, so they know what they do, hopefully. Also, regarding RFCs, they are hard to read, and information is often spread across several documents. They are often not written clearly, and they are not always up to date, but they are still an important reference, and I think it's a good advice to look at the RFCs from time to time, even if they are hard to read. So, thank you very much for your attention. If you want to talk to us, come to us at the Machine Deck Assembly in Hall 3, or join us at the next Pi and More, shameless plug here, January 14 in Krefeld, or at the University of Stuttgart starting in January. Thank you very much.
Now we have 8 minutes for questions. What do we have from the internet?
So we've got 2 questions from the internet. Can you hear me? Yeah. So at the diagram you showed one of the first slides, why does the authentication follow authorization? Shouldn't it normally be the other way around?
Yeah.
Barely. So.
Can you try to repeat the question?
Yeah, sorry. At the diagram you showed in one of the first slides, why does the authentication follow authorization? Shouldn't it normally be the other way around?
Okay. So these are 2 concepts that are kind of orthogonal to each other. You can either do authentication to ensure yourself of the user's identity, or you can act on the user's behalf at the identity provider, like posting on the user's Facebook timeline or doing different things there. But for authentication, you need to retrieve some unique user identifier, and this basically makes use of this authorization mechanism. So you get authorized to access this unique user identifier, and you use this then for authentication.
Thank you. Questions from here?
So for the espresso protocol, you said you need the forwarding party to check whether the certificate was actually from Wikipedia, not from attacker.com. But couldn't Alice do this check herself?
You mean that you present the user something and the user accepts this or declines this in this sense?
She has the challenge that is signed by her email provider, and she has the key that encrypted Wikipedia's identity. So she could use that to decrypt it and check if it's Wikipedia or attacker.com.
Yeah, in principle, yes.
So you mean the user could check?
Yeah.
Yes, the user could of course check. We could ask the user, did you really want to sign in at attacker.com or at wikipedia.com? But of course we all know that users are bad at making decisions. So, yeah.
Thank you. Questions from here?
Hi, thanks for the informative talk. But I wanted to add a remark. It is highly unfair to call users stupid for falling victim to click checking and phishing because they're working professionally on them, on enabling click checking and phishing. And if you need a 4K monitor just to see that there is some JavaScript added at like 1000 millimeters, it is impossible to blame the user for being stupid for falling victim to click checking. So just
yes, that is correct. Also, sometimes you just can't see it. So yes.
Thank you. Questions from down there? Sorry. Questions?
You talked about formal verification of both OAuth and your protocol. I wanted to know what kind of program or whatever you used, like Proverif, Tamarin, whatever. And also, I think you just proved you just verified a subset of OAuth.
Let's start with the second question first. So for OAuth, we really tried to introduce as many options as we could find in the standard, so to say. OAuth is a very loose standard, so they give you a lot of options in many ways. We had to exclude some of them for practical reasons when modeling the stuff, but we included almost all of the options that OAuth provides. And we also have a detailed write-up of what the options are and that we excluded and that we included. And now for the first part of the question, our model currently is a manual model. So what we do is pen and paper proofs. The reasoning behind this is that if you have tools, they are always in some sense limiting you. And when we started out with this work, there were two models essentially, already existing web models, formal web models, so in the same area as we are, but they were both based on a model checker, so one on ProVerif, the other one on another modeling tool, Alloy. And both were limited by the possibilities that you had in these model checkers. So we went the other way around. What we wanted to do is a manual model that includes, that models the web really precisely and comprehensively. And then as a second step, what we are currently working on or discussing about is to transfer this into some kind of tool.
Thank you.
Two more questions. Questions from the internet?
So I was wondering if you know about IndieAuth and RelMeAuth, and what you think about the question of using domain names versus email addresses as the user identifier.
Could you repeat that a bit louder, please?
So if you have any comments about IndieAuth and RelMeAuth, which uses the domain name as identifier rather than an email address.
So we didn't look at these systems.
Okay. Yes, last question.
The question regarding the forwarder and the privacy protection realized with the forwarder. As far as I understand, the forwarder is used in its own iframe to prevent the IDP from taking control of the verification process, knowing that who is the final system.
Yes.
But what if the identity provider and the forwarder collaborate? Then the privacy would be broken.
Yes. If we have these parties collaborating, then of course they are broken. So we haven't shown all the details of the system. So this is really hard to prevent. But in Espresso, the relying party is allowed to choose which forwarder has to be used. So relying party should choose a forwarder run by some trustworthy party. So this is the countermeasure to prevent collaboration. But if these parties collaborate, then you are screwed. Yes.
So I think it's also important to add, so the forwarder is kind of a semi-trusted party. Because on the one hand, we can enforce that it uses the correct code. Of course, the IDP then has to enforce this. On the other hand, you still have some side channels, like, for example, timing. So if you control the parties, then you could check which IP addresses access, for example, the forwarder and the IDP at the same time, and so on. So there are some side channels still. So the idea that we have to minimize this risk is to provide a set of trusted forwarders that could be, for example, provided by some trusted parties like Mozilla or the EFF or something, so that you have a set of forwarders to choose from and hopefully choose a trusted one.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Guido Schmidt and Daniel Fett, thank you so much for the great talk. Please give them another great round of applause.